This is part 1 of Module 2. This module describes the various forms of liability fiduciaries are subjected to and what actions they can take to help minimize that liability. Fiduciaries are subject to both criminal penalties and civil actions for any fiduciary breaches. The fiduciary is personally, financially liable for any losses resulting from a breach. With the exception of the named fiduciary, a plan fiduciary's personal liability to the plan is limited to the functions they perform or for which it can delegate. The Department of Labor may assess an additional penalty equal to as much as 20% of any recovery amount resulting from a breach. However, the DOL may also waive or reduce that penalty if they see fit. There is also a DOL voluntary fiduciary compliance program available for those people who have identified that they may have incurred a fiduciary breach prior to being identified by another regulatory entity. This can sometimes help them with reduced penalties and fees if they get approval for their compliance request. Any fiduciary who is aware of another fiduciary's actions that may violate legal standards must take all reasonable and legal steps to prevent such actions. By taking all reasonable and legal steps, the fiduciary will not incur liability for another fiduciary's actions, assuming reasonable efforts to remedy the breach are undertaken. A fiduciary cannot be held liable for a fiduciary breach that was committed before they became a fiduciary or after they became a fiduciary. Even if a fiduciary may not be liable for a breach, the fiduciary must take steps to remedy the situation if they become aware of any breach. And remember, the fiduciary resigning must do so in writing. The named fiduciary is not liable for designated fiduciary acts or omissions. However, they would be liable if they fail to monitor the designated fiduciary's activities. The named fiduciary should develop procedures for monitoring such individuals or entities. We recommend that a committee report to the named fiduciary on an annual basis and show the meeting minutes as evidence of what has transpired with the plan and suggestions where they might be taking it for the next year. Fiduciaries must follow plan procedures to terminate responsibilities. Sometimes the plan document will specify some of these procedures, but typically they do not. Again, there must be signed documentation for the termination of fiduciary responsibility and appointment of who will be assuming those responsibilities. Fiduciary liability insurance. Be very careful here. This is not a fidelity bond, and this is not other insurances in which typically exclude ERISA fiduciary claims to have this contract. This fiduciary insurance contract has to specifically identify ERISA claims. Fiduciary insurance protects fiduciaries and their personal assets from lawsuits from alleged breaches of fiduciary responsibilities. This should be reviewed to make sure their coverage is broad enough. An IPS must be drafted, signed, and must reflect the process of the investment due diligence that's taking place. Action steps for this information is to review or purchase fiduciary liability insurance and adopt a signed investment policy statement. The plan sponsor may decide to compensate employees who are fiduciaries with respect to any suits that may arise during their time as fiduciaries. This must be done so in writing. Plan fiduciaries need to understand the responsibilities and obligations under ERISA. Not to do so is itself a fiduciary breach. So they should implement and follow a fiduciary training program. Plan fiduciaries should document and monitor their roles and responsibilities, and they should follow written procedures and demonstrate compliance with the ERISA fiduciary standards. All this is included in our fiduciary fitness program. To mitigate liability, fiduciaries can also hire trustees and investment managers. Fiduciaries and trustees must also carefully monitor any co-fiduciaries that are hired. The action step here is to provide fiduciary education to all fiduciaries, and that's included in the education modules in this fiduciary fitness program.